All right, here we are today. We are going to talk about the second part of chapter 6. So, we're going to talk about trial and error and other problem solving strategies. So, the first problem solving strategy we're going to talk about is trial and error. Trial and error is basically where you try something, see if it works or not, and keep going through until you find something that works. Algorithms were basically a step-by-step problem-solving formula. This is where you do things step by step, bit by bit, in a certain way. It can be very time-consuming. Heuristics, on the other hand, allow you to do things in a shorter fashion, where it's often based upon previous information that you've already found out. It allows you to use shortcuts, or rule of thumb, or sometimes even working backwards, by focusing on the end result that you want and figuring out what you need to do in order to get there. Or you can break large tasks into a series of smaller tasks to make it simpler and easy. Heuristics are easier for us to comprehend oftentimes when we have too much information, we have a limited time to make the decision, it's unimportant, it's sort of just trivial when there's very little information. And we sometimes will use this in things when we're voting or deciding what card to buy. We don't always work through everything one step at a time, sort of like an algorithm, deciding what is the best option for us to use. All right, so let's do a couple of puzzles. First puzzle is a Sudoku. I recommend you taking a pause of the video right here and try to solve it. All right, hopefully you were able to solve the Sudoku. Now try this one. You want to connect all 9 dots without lifting your pen or from the paper. Take a few seconds, pause the video. When you're done and you figured it out or just want to give up, hit play. The solutions will be up next. Alright, here you go. Here's the answers. And for the pen and paper one on the right, notice that a lot of people who haven't seen this before are restricted by thinking they have to only use the dots and go from dot to dot and you can't go over. This is going to be something similar to a concept we're going to talk about soon called functional fixedness. Alright, so problem solving is what you just used. And so we talked about, and I just mentioned functional fixedness, which is the inability to look at something other than what it was designed for or using your sort of mental set. And what we can do is we can take a look at this. Imagine you have a candle, a thumbtack, and a box, and you need to mount the candle to the wall and light it. How do you do that? So most people would have a hard time, but as you can see in the box, to the right, they took the thumbtack, pushed it through the box, put the candle in the box, and lit it. Because we're not used to using things like that, it's sort of outside the norm. Alright, so let's talk about biases. We have the first up, which is anchoring bias, where you make a decision based on really one piece of information, such as looking at the rent for 2 identical places. One is $1,500 with all utilities, one is $1,200 with no utilities included. You make the assumption, I'm saving $300 per month. But the issue is, you have no idea how much the utilities are going to cost you, so you may not be saving as much. Confirmation bias is the tendency to focus on information that confirms your existing beliefs. Basically what you hope is going to happen. So, if you believe something is bad, you'll find something that supports that. If you find something is good, you'll find information that supports that. That's confirmation bias. Hindsight bias is when we believe we could have predicted something, such as an outbreak or a sporting event or something based on information, but there really wasn't enough information to allow us to make that prediction. Next up, we've got representative bias, which is the tendency to unintentionally stereotype someone or something without any real intent. Next up, we have the availability heuristic, which is basically we make a decision or we come to conclusions based on information that we've seen. Thinking about like, oh, I don't know anybody else who isn't like this. Like all my friends are Democrats or all my friends are Republicans. Something along those lines. Or all my friends drive SUVs. I don't know anybody that drives a car. It's just because you do not have enough information out there that you make this sort of mistake when coming to a decision. So we have now moved on to intelligence. So what is intelligence? Intelligence is, how smart people are, but it's very sort of nebulous. We've had lots of psychologists try to come through and define it. Charles Spearman was one of the first ones. He created what's called a factor called G, which just stands for general intelligence. He found that, if somebody's smart in one area, they tend to usually be smart in another area too. Raymond Cattell broke these down into two types of intelligences. Crystallized, which is all the knowledge you've gained, and fluid intelligence, which is the ability to, problem solve and think on the fly. Crystallized intelligence continues to grow throughout your life, whereas fluid intelligence starts to wane after you get to about 25. Next up, we've got Sternberg's triarchic theory, and he breaks it into three different types. We've got practical, creative, and analytical. Practical, creative, and analytical. Analytical is about problem solving. Creative is coming up with new, interesting ways to solve problems. And practical intelligence could be thought of as street smarts or what we like to think of as common sense. Gardner broke it down further into 8 types of intelligence. There's linguistics, which is ability to talk, logical, mathematical, musical, idea to see music and how it works, bodily, kinesthetic, how your body works, spatial, can look at an area and be like, oh, I can parallel park there. Interpersonal, it's the ability to work with people, sort of like an emotional intelligence. Intrapersonal, so talking about yourself. And then naturalist, how the world works. Emotional intelligence is the ability to understand the emotions of yourself and others and show empathy. All right, next up we're going to talk about creativity. And really we can summarize creativity as the ability to generate, create, or discover new ideas, solutions, and possibilities. Creative people usually work on it for years. They try to find novel solutions. They're really good at avoiding functional fixedness. They seek out advice of others and experts to help them kind of problem solve. They will also be risk takers. Now, there's 2 types of creativity thinking. There's divergent thinking, which is thinking outside the box. Basically, there's more than one solution for every situation, and you try to think about what the best new way or creative way of solving a problem is. Next up, we've got convergent thinking, where is the ability to provide a correct or well-established answer for a solution or a problem. And we try to think of what is the best practice and how to go about implementing it. That would be an example of convergent thinking. All right, so let's get back to more of measures of intelligence. A person's IQ is called their intelligence quotient. Stanford Binet was the first person to talk about it, or one of the first big ones. They talked about standardization, so that's why if you hear of an IQ score, it's usually on a scale of 100. This way we can compare everybody across ages and demographics and come up with a interpretable result. We come up with a norm, and so what is the average? And so we use norms and standardization to be able to look at our IQ scores. One of the first big measures of intelligence that's still used to this day is called the WAIS, or the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale. It looks at a bunch of verbal and nonverbal skills, and it is extensively used. There is one for the children, which is called the WISC, which is called the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children. And it looks at 5 different areas: verbal, visual, fluid reasoning, working memory, and processing speed. So verbal, how well you can understand; visual, spatial, how things relate to each other; reasoning, so understanding how things work together; working memory is how many numbers you can remember; and processing speed, so how quickly you can solve problems. There's also what's called the Flynn effect, which is basically stating that every generation has a significantly higher IQ, usually about 3 points than the previous one. Part of the reason why we think the Flynn effect occurs is because we're now working with more abstract ideas than previous generations where they dealt with more concrete ideas. So it's not necessarily that we are having more and more intelligent people. It's that the way that we're testing it is more apt to people who are using this type of abstract thought. One of the big discussions within intelligence is, what is the source of intelligence? Is it nature or nurture? Studies have shown that 70% of intelligence can be attributed to the mother, or there's a correlation of 0.7. We've looked at identical twins raised together and identical twins raised apart, and they exhibit a much higher relationship than fraternal twins raised together, indicating that genetics play a really large perspective. But if you recall, we talked about epigenetics previously, which is really very well related to the nurture perspective, which means that if a parent presents children with intellectual stimulation, it'll reflect their intelligence level, and they will move accordingly. And there's sort of this bandwidth that people can move within, so there's nature and nurture together. Range of reaction further supports this. They talk about genetic makeup is fixed, and that whether or not you reach your full intellectual potential is dependent upon environmental factors, which is why a lot of parents will put their children in the most rigorous and hardest classes and try to really give them a leg up. The research doesn't necessarily support this at younger ages for children. At later ages, the research is a little bit more supportive. So let's talk about different types of learning disabilities. We've got dysgraphia and dyslexia. Dyslexia is one of the more common ones. It's where people process the letters and look at them incorrectly. So if you look at to the right, where you can see it says teapot, but then all of a sudden it just starts, looking differently, that's how someone with dyslexia might see different words. Now we have dysgraphia, which is the inability to draw or put things down onto paper. There are quite a few different types of learning disabilities, but that's what we are covering for this. All right. That is all for Chapter 6, and I look forward to talking to you about the next chapter.